When you look at an old family photograph, there is this unspoken assumption of absolute truth.
Oh, definitely.
Like you see a mother holding a child and you just know intrinsically that is her kid. It feels totally binary.
Right. It's just a biological fact, captured right there on film.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of the story we are exploring today in this deep dive, and suddenly that photograph just starts to blur completely.
It really does. It's wild.
Today, we are looking at a historical landscape that is entirely destabilizing. We're digging into this really incredible breakdown from the YouTube channel Brew.
Yeah, they did a fantastic job with this.
They really did. It details the century-old mystery of the family who never knew their son was replaced. And this isn't just like a standard 1912 missing persons case.
No, not at all.
It is a terrifying exploration into the extreme limits of human memory. We're looking at how pure desperation can literally overwrite physical reality and why eyewitnesses, even when they're absolutely certain, are notoriously unreliable.
I mean, we're talking about two completely different mothers here, separated by hundreds of miles, massive social divides, and they're both claiming the exact same boy as their own.
It's just so hard to wrap your head around.
It is. We are looking at a scenario where an entire town basically convinced itself of a swapped identity, and they built a narrative so ironclad that it took nearly 100 years and, the advent of modern DNA testing to finally tear it down.
Wow.
But to understand how a society could get this so incredibly wrong, you really have to look at the intense emotional baseline where the tragedy actually started.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to go back to August 23, 1912.
Right.
To a place called Swayze Lake in Louisiana. And you have to picture the geography here because it dictates literally everything that follows.
The setting is everything in this case.
It really is. This is not some calm, serene, recreational lake. This is a treacherous, unforgiving marshland. You have this thick, sucking mud from receding floodwaters.
Yeah, and the shoreline is carved with these steep, 15-foot drops straight into murky water.
Exactly. And the entire ecosystem is heavily populated with alligators.
Which is just a profoundly dangerous environment for an adult to navigate, let alone a toddler. I mean, their situational awareness is practically non-existent.
It's a nightmare scenario. So Percy and Lessie Dunbar, this well-to-do local family, they're out there on a trip with friends. Their 4-year-old son Bobby and 2-year-old son Alonzo are playing near the water.
Right.
And the inciting incident hinges on a family friend, a man named Paul Muzzy. He's out in the shallows shooting garfish with a pistol.
Which, by the way, garfish are these prehistoric-looking creatures. They have these massive, thin, hummingbird-like beaks.
Yeah, they're wild-looking. So after shooting one, Muzzy heads back up to the cabin for lunch. And as he runs past 4-year-old Bobby, he's carrying 2-year-old Alonzo on his shoulders.
Okay.
And he jokingly yells down, "Get out of the way, Heavy, or I'll run over you."
And Bobby, who was known to be this fiercely independent and notoriously mischievous kid, he immediately yells back, "You can't do it. You ain't no bigger than me."
So sassy.
Very sad.
But those words were very likely the last things Bobby ever said. Because when Muzzy gets back to the cabin, Lessie Dunbar looks at him, totally confused, and just asks, "Where's Bobby?"
Oh man, that stomach drop feeling.
Exactly. Muzzy's face drops. He realizes Bobby didn't follow him up the path. The boy has just vanished. They rush back to the water, and the only physical clues they find are a set of tiny footprints in the dirt.
And those footprints just lead up to a nearby set of railroad tracks, and then
They just stop. Nothing else.
the panic that sets in at that exact moment, it triggers a reaction that is almost unfathomable in its scale. I mean, you have a missing child in an environment designed to swallow people whole.
Total chaos erupts. The search they mount is so frantic and honestly terrifying in its execution.
Yeah.
Like 500 people from the surrounding towns descend on this dangerous swamp.
500 people, that's a massive footprint.
Huge. And they start dragging the bottom of the lake with heavy iron hooks. When that doesn't work, they resort to throwing literal sticks of dynamite into the water.
Just unbelievable.
They were hoping the underwater concussions would force a submerged body to float to the surface. They even start catching alligators and slicing their bellies open on the banks to see if the boy's remains are inside.
It is a completely visceral, violent reaction to helplessness. They're just tearing the physical environment apart, looking for any trace of control.
And the only detail the family can cling to is that Bobby had been wearing a straw hat that morning. So searchers tested an identical straw hat in the lake and found that it didn't sink.
Right.
Because of that, they assumed that even if Bobby drowned, they would at least find the hat floating in the reeds. But they never find it. which gives the Dunbars this incredibly dangerous sliver of false hope that he didn't drown at all.
And that tiny sliver of hope is the catalyst that begins to warp the entire narrative. When the dragging and the dynamite yield no body, the parents, and really by extension the community, they pivot.
They have to.
Yeah, they pivot to the only other explanation their minds can tolerate, which is kidnapping.
You know, I keep thinking about the fog of war in this context. In military terms, that's the sheer confusion and chaos on a battlefield where you can no longer trust the information you are receiving.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, and in missing persons cases, there is this psychological fog of war. A panicked brain loses all sense of agency, so it just starts throwing anything at the wall. Like using dynamite in a lake isn't an investigative strategy.
No, not at all.
It is pure desperation masquerading as action. And when they pivot to the kidnapping theory, that fog of war just rolls over the entire region.
Absolutely. Percy Dunbar raises the reward for his son's return to $6,000, which in 1912 money, that is the equivalent of nearly $200,000 today.
That is life-changing money.
Exactly. And in the deeply prejudiced climate of Louisiana at that time, dangling that kind of wealth turns the entire public into an opportunistic, highly biased detective force.
Right.
Anxiety quickly looked for a scapegoat.
And prejudice takes a wheel almost immediately.
Yeah.
The Brew breakdown points out that locals were highly suspicious of immigrants and minorities. Suddenly, you have armed posses chasing down an Italian woman simply because she happened to be walking down a road with a young boy.
Which is horrifying.
It is. Then they are hunting down African-American lumber workers who were seen anywhere near the lake. All of it based on nothing but racial bias. All of them complete dead ends.
The desperation from that failed swap search directly laid the groundwork for the Dunbars to force a miracle into existence. Their grief was so unbearable, so all-consuming, that they just needed a resolution to end the pain.
8 months of this agonizing limbo passes.
8 months.
Yeah. Then, in April 1913, that desperation finally finds a target. A telegram comes in from Poplarville, Mississippi. Law enforcement there has arrested a traveling handyman named William Walters.
And Walters is moving through the area in a mule and buggy with a young boy.
Right, and locals grew suspicious because Walters' story about the boy's identity seemed evasive. Sometimes he said it was his child, sometimes he said it was his brother's.
Well, and in 1912, a single man traveling with a child out of wedlock was highly scrutinized, so Walters was likely just trying to deflect those questions.
Makes sense. But Percy Dunbar doesn't care about context. He rushes to Mississippi, hoping beyond hope it's Bobby.
But the reunion is nothing like a grieving father finding his lost son. Percy arrives, sees this boy covered in road dirt, and calls out, "Bobby!"
And what happens?
The child shows absolutely zero recognition. He physically fights Percy, pushing the man away in fear.
And Percy tries to justify the rejection, assuming the kidnapper must have brainwashed the boy to fear him. But then we get to the physical evidence, which is just...
It's glaring.
Yeah. I mean, yes, there are minor coincidences. The boy mispronounces the word automobile as odal, which Bobby used to do. He also has a mole and a faint scar over his eye. But he is entirely missing Bobby Dunbar's most defining physical feature.
The burn scar.
Exactly. A severe, deep burn scar on his big toe from stepping on hot ashes as a baby. This boy's toe is perfectly smooth. Furthermore, his eyes are shaped completely differently.
And the rationalizations used to explain away these physical impossibilities become truly extraordinary.
They really do.
A local doctor gets involved and actually claims that the boy's eye shape must have changed due to swollen adenoids.
Which is crazy.
Right. Adenoids are small patches of tissue high up in the throat, behind the nasal cavity. If they get infected, they swell, which can make a child breathe through their mouth and look temporarily puffy.
Temporarily being the key word.
Exactly. But this doctor used that basic biological function to bizarrely claim it permanently altered the child's orbital bone structure. He also suggested the missing burn scar on the toe simply rubbed off from walking barefoot on dirt roads.
Okay, I have to push back forcefully on the absurdity of those medical claims. Swollen throat glands do not change the permanent shape of a human being's eyes.
No, they don't.
And a deep, third-degree tissue burn scar does not just exfoliate away from walking. And beyond the medical excuses, how does a mother not recognize her own flesh and blood?
That is the million-dollar question.
When Lessie Dunbar finally arrives in Mississippi to examine the boy, she looks at it under lamplight and she literally says, "I do not know. I'm not quite sure."
Yeah.
She explicitly states his eyes aren't large enough. She only confirms it is him the following day after giving the boy a bath. How does a mother not know the instant she sees him?
What's fascinating here is the sheer overriding power of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is that agonizing mental friction you feel when your deeply held beliefs completely clash with objective reality.
Right.
You have to look at Lessie's psychological state. Historical accounts described her as being more a skeleton than a woman at this point.
Oh, wow.
She was physically depleted and mentally broken by 8 months of unresolved trauma. For Lessie, the reality of the situation, a boy with the wrong eyes and a missing scar, was violently clashing with her desperate need for her son to be alive.
And the human brain cannot sustain that level of stress indefinitely.
Exactly. She unconsciously overwrote the physical facts because the alternative, accepting that her child was rotting at the bottom of a swamp, was psychologically unsurvivable.
She needed him to be Bobby, so her brain manufactured Bobby. But the boy already had an identity. William Walters, the handyman sitting in a jail cell, insists the boy is Bruce Anderson.
Right.
He explains that Bruce is the illegitimate son of his brother and a woman named Julia Anderson. Walters claims Julia gave him the boy temporarily so he could take him on the road and provide for him.
And because the physical evidence connecting the boy to the Dunbars was so incredibly weak, the public and the media needed something else to latch onto to make the narrative stick.
They needed a villain.
Exactly. This transitions the entire saga into a massive clash of class dynamics. Societal status, not objective truth, ultimately decided this boy's fate.
So Julia Anderson travels 900 miles from North Carolina down to Louisiana to get her son back. Her background is a heartbreaking catalog of tragedy.
It really is.
She is 19 years old. On the very first day of her marriage, her abusive, drunk husband shot her in the foot. She fled that violent household and eventually had 3 children out of wedlock with different men.
And in the rigid moral framework of 1912, that background meant society completely discarded her.
Yep.
The press viciously branded her as loose, uneducated, and scandalous before she even arrived in town.
It is infuriating. Julia arrives, utterly exhausted, having not seen her son in 15 months. And the Dunbar lawyers set up this incredibly cruel psychological test.
Oh, this part is so hard to hear.
It's awful. They
Yeah.
don't just bring the boy out to her. They present her with a lineup of wrong boys first, specifically trying to confuse her and break her fragile confidence.
She is surrounded by a hostile committee of Dunbar friends, wealthy relatives, and journalists who have already collectively decided she's a liar trying to steal a rich family's child.
And under the weight of all that hostility, she falters. She hesitates to pick the boy out immediately.
Which is totally understandable given the pressure.
Exactly. It's like a rigged theater production. The wealthy Dunbars were the directors. They controlled the stage, they paid for the lighting, and Julia Anderson was cast as the villain before she even walked into the room.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
The New Orleans item actually printed this horrific quote about her hesitation. They wrote, "Animals don't forget, but this big, coarse country woman forgot." Wait, let me rephrase that. They wrote, "Animals don't forget, but this big, coarse country woman forgot. She hopes her son isn't dead, just as she hopes the cotton crop will be good this year. Of true mother's love, she has none."
This raises an important question about how history constructs truth. In 1912, objective facts like a missing toe scar were entirely secondary. Truth was dictated by societal status and public sympathy.
Right.
The Dunbars were prosperous, prominent, and grieving, therefore they were automatically given the benefit of the doubt. Julia was poor, scandalous, and vulnerable, therefore her trauma was weaponized against her to invalidate her claim.
A judge did eventually grant Julia a second, much fairer visit, where she confidently identified the boy as Bruce. She knew it was him, but the damage was already done.
Yeah.
Facing violent physical threats from the locals in Louisiana, and having absolutely no money to hire legal representation, she was forced to flee. She had to leave the boy behind.
Just heartbreaking. With Julia driven out of town, the narrative was cemented. William Walters was convicted of kidnapping, though he was released a couple of years later on a legal technicality.
But the town, the justice system, and the Dunbars collectively agreed. This boy was Bobby Dunbar.
And the court handed the Dunbars a child, but a judge's gavel doesn't magically rewire a boy's brain.
No, it doesn't.
So what happens internally when a 4-year-old is forced to live an assigned identity? He grows up as Bobby Dunbar, but it is not the fairy tale ending the newspapers promised. The family completely fractures.
Percy Dunbar is actually jailed for assault later in life, and Lessie ends up leaving him, moving away to New Orleans.
And for the boy himself, living as Bobby. But biologically, Bruce, his adult life, is haunted by the lingering ghost of an identity he couldn't quite articulate.
He was moderately famous because of the case,
Right.
constantly questioned by strangers about his past.
Yes. And there are these incredible moments from his adult life where he actually crosses paths with Julia Anderson's real children, who are biologically his half-siblings.
Oh, wow.
He meets a man named Hollis at an ice house. Bobby just lingers there, chatting, asking highly specific questions, but never fully admitting who he is.
That is so intense.
Later, he goes to a cafe run by Julia's daughter, Jewel. He sits at the counter for half an hour drinking coffee, interrogating her about her family life, completely ignoring everyone else in the diner.
It is a heartbreaking image. He clearly carried a profound, unspoken doubt his entire life. But there is a fascinating scientific explanation for why he didn't just stand up and declare, "I am Bruce Anderson."
Right, it comes down to the mechanics of infantile amnesia.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When this swap happened, the boy was 4 years old. At that age, the brain is an absolute construction zone.
Completely.
The hippocampus, which is the brain's memory center, is rapidly integrating new neurons to acquire advanced language, motor skills, and complex environmental awareness.
And when those new neurons integrate into the hippocampus at such a staggering rate, they physically disrupt the older, fragile memory circuits.
Oh, interesting.
The structural foundation of early episodic memories gets essentially bulldozed to make room for new cognitive abilities. That is why most adults have extremely patchy, unreliable memories from between the ages of 4 and 7.
So think of a 4-year-old's memory like a jigsaw puzzle that is missing half its pieces. The structure isn't stable.
Right.
If every single authority figure around you, the police, the judges, the wealthy family feeding you and clothing you, keeps handing you pieces that belong to an entirely different puzzle, your brain will eventually force them to fit.
Absolutely. You will adapt your own internal memories to survive in the reality you are trapped in.
And the malleability of memory wasn't just limited to the developing brain of a child. The unreliability of adult witnesses in this case is staggering. People were completely fabricating testimonies to fit the narrative they wanted to believe.
Oh, the witness accounts are wild. One person claimed they literally saw William Walters magically swap 2 identical boys at a rural roadhouse.
What?
Yeah. Another witness claimed Walters was walking around town announcing to random crowds that he was a detective bringing Bobby Dunbar in for the reward money. Pure fiction.
He goes right back to that fog of war concept. When a case is heavily sensationalized in the headlines, it contaminates the jury pool and the community mind.
It really does.
People unconsciously insert themselves into the narrative. They construct false memories based on what they read in the paper. And the terrifying part of mass hysteria is that they usually believe those false memories are completely true.
But the unreliability of memory, the intense class prejudice of the 1912 courts, the crushing desperation of a grieving mother, none of that could stand up to the one thing that simply does not forget.
DNA.
Exactly. We fast forward almost a century. In 1999, Bobby's granddaughter, Margaret, begins studying Lessie Dunbar's massive personal scrapbook of the case.
And she meticulously reads the clippings and realizes the newspapers from 1912 were full of wild contradictions.
They were totally made up.
The Tacoma Times printed a story about the Dunbars finding Bobby hidden in a pile of straw, with Lessie dramatically crying out, "It's my boy!"
So true.
It was literally written like a dime store novel to sell copies.
Seeing all these historical lies laid bare, Margaret's father, Robert Dunbar Jr., who is the son of the boy raised, as Bobby decides he needs to know the absolute truth.
Right.
In 2004, suffering from congestive heart failure and knowing his time is limited, he wants to definitively prove his Dunbar lineage. He compares his DNA to a man named David, who is the son of Alonzo Dunbar, the little brother who was actually there at the lake that day in 1912.
They take the swabs. They send them to the lab. After nearly 100 years of debate, of destroyed lives, of fractured families, the results come back.
And it is no Massey-H.
None whatsoever. They did not share a bloodline. The boy raised as Bobby Dunbar was, definitively and biologically Bruce Anderson all along.
It is a staggering revelation, and we really need to pause and absorb the horror of what that means.
Yeah.
If the boy from Mississippi was Bruce, then the real Bobby Dunbar never left Swayze Lake. He almost certainly fell off that steep railroad trestle and drowned in August 1912.
The 500 people throwing dynamite and searching the marsh were likely standing directly over his watery grave the entire time.
It's chilling, and it completely reframes Julia Anderson's life as well. The woman vilified by the press, who had her child legally stolen by a wealthier family, actually went on to have a deeply fulfilling life despite the trauma.
She really did.
She settled in Mississippi, married a kind man named Ollie Rawls, became a highly respected nurse and midwife in her community, and raised 7 children, though she never stopped fighting for Bruce in her heart.
When the DNA results came back, it completely shattered the Dunbar family's foundational narrative. But out of that wreckage, there is this incredibly beautiful, resilient sentiment from Robert Jr. at the very end of his life.
Yeah, his response was amazing.
When talking about the father who raised him, an identity built on a century-old lie, he said, "I know who I am, and I know who you are, and nothing else matters."
It is a profound conclusion to reach after learning your entire history was fabricated.
So what does this all mean? It is a conscious decision by Robert Jr. that the love you shared, the life you actually lived together in the quiet moments, matters infinitely more than the biological truth that was denied to you by history.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to re-examine how we construct our own realities. This event proves that objective truth can be entirely overwritten by authority, by the media, by the power of suggestion, and by the blinding force of grief.
Right.
An entire justice system and a whole town collectively agreed to a lie because it was more palatable than the tragic truth of a dead child.
Even the boy himself was ultimately convinced. He lived his entire life inside someone else's puzzle.
He really did.
So I want to circle back to that idea of the old family photograph we talked about at the beginning. The things you see is absolute binary truth. If an entire society, the courts, and even a child's own brain could fabricate an identity so thoroughly that it lasted a century, well, let me ask you this. What absolute certainties in your own life, the foundational stories about who you are, might just be puzzle pieces handed to you by someone else until they fit?
A haunting thought to leave on.
It really is. Until next time.